The birth of art in prehistory is a complex question. For some, it was the fruit of a mental revolution which started 40,000 years ago. For others, it was the result of a long evolution which began with the appearance of the first men 2 million years ago. Our ancestors progressively freed themselves from their immediate survival needs. They devoted a growing part of their time to artistic activities. They decorated their objects and sites where they established themselves. With the Magdalenians, our ancestors who settled in a large part of Europe between 18,000 and 11,000 BC, art was developed to an exceptional level. Their masterpieces have crossed the millennia and bring us a partial and mysterious testimony of their culture.
If we take into account the overall makeup of Lascaux with its themes, the diversity of species, its composition, and also its dates of around 18 to 19,000 years ago, we can reasonably consider that it's at the very beginning of the Magdalenian.
Amongst around 200 prehistoric cave art sites in Europe, about 2/3 are attributed to the Magdalenian period, between 18,000 and 10,000 years BC. Through major sites like Lascaux or Altamira in Spain, we now know of the painting talents of Magdalenian artists. Their gifts as sculptors and rock carvers are less well known. However, some sites, like Cap Blanc near Lascaux, testify to their exceptional mastery of sculpture. But it is the little village of Angles-sur-l'Anglin in Poitou-Charentes which holds what is certainly the greatest treasure of Magdalenian sculpture. At the foot of the limestone cliffs that line the river hides a site which is the only one of its kind in the world. In a rock shelter is a sculpted frieze dating from 15,000 BC that adorns the wall for nearly 30 meters.
The sculpted frieze of the Roc-aux-Sorciers at Angles-sur-l'Anglin, with its beauty, its richness, but especially with the technical complexity of its monumental sculptural plan, is certainly the sculptural equivalent of the Lascaux paintings.
Discovered for the first time in 1927, the Roc-aux-Sorciers site was, at the time, completely covered with debris from rockfalls and erosion. It was only in 1947 that Suzanne de Saint-Mathurin and her English friend, two strong-willed women undertook over a decade to clear the thousands of cubic meters of gravel, mobilizing the forces of the village, men, women, and children. Geneviève Pinson is the scientist in charge of this unique site.
Extract of the digging diary of Suzanne de Saint-Mathurin, Wednesday, 28th September 1949. Very big excavation, an extremely rich area. Beside the slope, a very thick lens of sandy clay, sticky, light yellow, coating many small bits of limestone. Objects had slipped between the stones. Gounod found an entire needle in 3 fragments, broken in the past. A large throwing spearhead, a greater size than usual. A throwing spearhead with a pointed base, scraper, magnificent flint, shell, etc.
The Roc-aux-Sorciers site is made up of 2 rock shelters. The Taillebourg cave and the Bourdois shelter, which are about 15 meters apart. This sculpture Lascaux offers teams of archaeologists an immensely rich area of exploration.
La frise du Roc-aux-Sorciers, dans la forme sous laquelle elle nous apparaît
The
aujourd'hui,
Roc-aux-Sorciers frieze in the form we see today is an absolutely monumental work in its development, its length, in the density of the work. In this sense, it's the result of a project, the absolutely clear intention of a social group.
Une intentionnalité d'un groupe social absolument évident. Les groupes humains
Human groups must have stayed here for long periods in order to progressively complete this masterpiece.
progressivement compléter ce chef-d'œuvre. Ils ont sans doute choisi aussi le site en fonction de sa position dans un paysage.
They doubtless chose the site because of its territorial location, but also because the rock wall could be carved, because the presence of sculpture in the shelters implies the presence of light, and certainly a link with the light of day, with the group and its activities. I think that the sculpted frieze of the Roc-aux-Sorciers can't be disassociated from the whole of social life.
At the foot of the sculpted walls, digging has unearthed evidence of many hearths, as well as decorated objects, jewelry, lamps made of limestone, paint pots, flint tools, reindeer antlers or mammoth ivory. The link between art and habitation in the Magdalenian period is one of the great questions posed by this site.
Suzanne de Saint-Mathurin unearthed this bison, which is still here on the cave's ceiling. Several rings can be seen on the bison, one at the head, one touching the hindquarters, and one touching the rear hooves. These rings doubtless had 2 roles, a symbolic role to do with the work, and a functional role linked to the habitation.
These rings included in the sculptures would have allowed objects to be suspended, cords to be attached. The symmetrical arrangement of rings above and below the arch lead us to think it may have been a system for spreading skins. These supple and detachable screens would have served to define areas of domestic and artistic occupation in the shelter, or to separate certain groups of occupants from each other. The interpretation of these adorned sites, the reasons which led our ancestors to create such artwork, remains a great question.
The interpretation of prehistoric art has evolved along with the ideas of prehistorians and the evolution of archaeological science. At the start, at the end of the 19th century, it was logical that it was art for art's sake. Magic and totemism were important. Progressively, from the 1950s and 60s, we began to work on the archaeological content of the sites and to give the artwork a place in that content. Right now, the approach tends to be to try and contextualize the artistic expression. Nowadays, it appears that the sites, which have greatly diverse archaeological remains, and as well as that have large-scale artworks on their walls, were therefore long-term habitats.
But who were the occupants of these sites 15,000 years ago? One man is trying to gather precious clues about the ways of life and the environment of our Magdalenian ancestors by the study of their skeletons. Roberto Macchiarelli is a paleoanthropologist and professor of paleoanthropology at the University of Poitiers. He has come to the Museum of Périgueux to select some elements of one of the very rare original Magdalenian skeletons. We can see here the cast of the Magdalenian tomb of Chancelade. There's an almost complete skeleton of an individual who was buried in a fetal position. I'm going to select elements of the original skeleton for analysis. By using a 3D scan of precise parts of the skeleton, like the jaw, the teeth, the bones of the arms or of the legs, he can gather information about the bone structure and morphology of the Magdalenians. These elements allow the construction of hypotheses about their physical capacities and their way of life. Having already made 3D scans of Neanderthal skeletons, Roberto Macchiarelli can in this way compare distinctive features in terms of evolution over a period of around 10,000 years. Results published by Roberto Macchiarelli show important changes in skeletal structure and in the teeth. Magdalenian bone thickness is 150% less than that of the Neanderthals. Differences which reflect very important changes in lifestyle, expenditure of physical energy, and relationship to the environment. But what were the faces of our artist ancestors like? Starting from the skull of the Chancelade skeleton, one of the very rare Magdalenian skeletons discovered, Elizabeth Daines, sculptor and artist, world-renowned for her reconstitutions of hominids, is trying to scientifically reproduce a Magdalenian face. An identical picture closer to our own faces than Neanderthal man, mysteriously extinct 28,000 years ago. Traces of the Magdalenian culture are found over a very large part of Europe, ranging from Spain to the Ukraine, the United Kingdom, in France, Germany, Belgium, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Population movement during this period, as well as the spread of this culture, can both be explained by climate. Dominique Gentil is a researcher at the Laboratory of Climate Sciences at the Atomic Energy Commission. He is working on the dating and chronology of ancient climates. In the cave Villars in the Périgord, he is looking for precious clues to help understand the characteristics of the European climate of 15,000 years ago. Stalagmites, which grow a maximum of 1 millimeter each year, according to the quantity of water that infiltrates, are precious to the science of ancient climates called paleoclimatology. This stalagmite recorded climatic history over 50,000 years, between 80,000 and 30,000 years ago. It stopped growing because climatic conditions became too cold, and there was no more infiltration. This one took up the relay at around 16,000 years ago, so it corresponds to the Magdalenian period, and stopped about 8,000 years ago. It recorded a period of the history of the deglaciation of that period. The stalagmites are cut according to their axis of growth to make a first dating by uranium-234 and evaluate which period they cover. Then, with the aid of a micro-drill, Dominique Gentil pierces the stalagmite at different points about 3 millimeters apart. The powder which he collects from each point allows him to measure the proportion of atoms contained in the stalagmite that are more or less heavy in oxygen and in carbon. This proportion varies in function of temperature, humidity, vegetation cover, and microbe activity in the soil. These elements are dissolved in the water that infiltrates and are found in the stalagmites. This research tells us that the Magdalenian period was marked by a warming process about 15,000 years ago, followed by a sudden cooling of 5 to 10 degrees between 12,700 and 11,500 BC. Groups of hunter-gatherers descended towards the south during periods of glaciation and moved back to territories situated more in the north when the climate warmed. These successive cold and warm periods also contributed to the destabilization of the rock shelters due to the fall of blocks of limestone. Through the millennia, climatic hazards mistreated not only our ancestors, but also the artwork they left us. This frieze of Magdalenian horses is covered with a fine layer of calcite. It's continually being formed, as you can see by the drops of water falling at the moment, and we can expect that in a few decades or a few hundred years they'll be completely covered and vanish from sight. The paintings and sculptures on rock walls are the principal information which remains for us to better understand this civilization, which is why their preservation is so important. At Angles-sur-l'Anglin, the race against deterioration of blocks has begun. Expert teams are trying to reveal the carvings and pigments of blocks that have crumbled from the rock face. These restoration operations demand patience and precision. Now we're starting to be able to see something, polychromy, which we can see pretty well with red marks, a red background for example, and black marks almost wiped out, and especially very fine cuts making figures which will have to be studied. Exploring this culture is like piecing together a puzzle. The frequence of certain motifs, their layout, their proportions, are all so many clues to decode the significance of these works and the context within which they were created. This little fragment has an unusual history because it comes from the Tyberg cave, 20 meters from here. And it has allowed us to unite these two quite huge blocks. So we see the complexity of the puzzle to bring all these fragments together, knowing that there are 350 other fragments from this site in the Museum of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Representations of animals are very numerous and finely executed. But other motifs are also found on the rock shelter's walls. Symbols of femininity, which raise the question of the place of women in Magdalenian society and which trace out the different states of the female body throughout life. The young pregnant woman, the mature woman, and the aged woman who has lost all her fullness. Some sites also have human profiles. Had the Magdalenians discovered portrait art?
All throughout the Paleolithic, representations of humans are rare, but it must be remembered that humans were relatively rare at the time, and it was animals that dominated. We can observe, despite this, that in the Magdalenian, there are really a lot more representations of humans with detail of the head, as if there was somehow an interest, maybe not in portraits, but perhaps in entering into the personality of the people depicted, and there we may have something that would have an impact on Magdalenian art.
Some profiles are detailed and doubtless are the result of a will to realistic representation. Other faces seem deformed. Their weird faces could have a simple explanation. The feeble light of oil lamps projected on the walls the shadows of deformed faces which the carvers represented. Carved faces are also found in great number on tablets of flat stone, found sometimes by the thousands in some Magdalenian shelters. This is the case at La Marche, where more than 1,500 tablets have been collected.
The interpretation of deposits of carved tablets, or those which in any case have been found in large numbers at certain sites, which are confined caves, is quite open. Despite that, we can identify a special manner of representing humans and animals by having repeated the traces many times, numerous times. The work is a lot more spontaneous and free than that which is on the walls. They may have been made during rituals, or perhaps they served an educational purpose, learning to draw, to represent. In any case, it's a phenomenon that marks the Magdalenian.
Some archaeologists also think that these tablets were meant for decorated paving for some shelters. Dr. Léon Pallis and Marie de Saint-Prieuse, two of the key figures of 20th century Paleolithic archaeology, took very precise measurements of the carved tablets of La Marche in the 1970s, which they brought together in a book. Following this path, Nicolas Maillard from the Musée de l'Homme continues the analysis of the carved motifs. Right, I'll start with this one, thanks. The one with the newborn. Thanks. With the help of new technologies, he examines the tablets in their smallest detail. "3D micromapping allows him to analyze the traces of carving and their respective depth with extreme precision. He can try to deduce what tools the sculptor used, and also spot marks which have been almost erased that bear witness to older motifs. Many tablets have multiple superimposed carvings with tangles of marks of different depths. This leads us to think that the tablets were reused many times, a little like magic slates, where a drawing is erased so another can be drawn. Reading the carvings using technology tells me about the approach which the prehistoric artists used when they produced these representations. At these moments, you feel very close to the gestures made by the Magdalenian sculptors. In a period where metal did not yet exist, the tools of the Magdalenian sculptor were reduced to chisels, scrapers, tools for piercing, and flint blades. Each one of these tools had its function. Lucie Chamanat and Sylvie Berriès are trying to associate certain special tools with the marks and incisions on the sculpted blocks from the Roc-aux-Sorciers.
Sylvie, do you think that there were some tools that were used to flatten out this area here? You can see it here too. You see there's a kind of furrow and then a very flat area. There were probably a certain number of blades that were the biggest blades, like this one here, and the most solid, upon which we can observe a very circular movement on the material worked, which would have removed a lot of material. As well, you can see strokes which are completely oriented in one direction. Or you can see that there are a succession of marks. It's very likely to be, and even has to be, that the stone was much softer at the time it was worked, because the tool has gone into the stone.
The techniques range from the fine traces left by the point of a chisel to the deeper incisions, vigorously defining the contours. In some sites, like at Angles-sur-l'Anglin, the removal of large amounts of stone was necessary for the bas-reliefs to appear.
The accomplishment and highly impressive nature of great prehistoric artistic masterpieces, such as those at the Roc-aux-Sorciers and its sculpted frieze, implies that there were great masters, that in prehistoric times there were artists as accomplished as Michelangelo, filled with purpose, with exceptional savoir-faire and capable of recording the thought of their society.
We can't exclude the idea that some of these artists had a following and created a style which we find at several sites.
When we study the manner of depicting anatomical details, for example on the animals, we have the impression that we are in the presence of a particular style. That is to say that a human group had its own special way of depicting such elements.
This is the theory that Geneviève Pinson is trying to verify by comparing the site of Roc-aux-Sorciers to a site which is some 200 kilometers away, called La Chère-à-Calvin. Using projection, she is superimposing the motifs recorded at Roc-aux-Sorciers on the carvings of la chair à Calvin.
Faudrait m'éclairer le cheval.
Oui, on va t'éclairer le cheval.
Là,
c'est bien.
Did you see that?
Super.
And there, exactly the same thing. Oh, that's nice. That's really nice. I'm happy we're doing this. Can you imagine how that must have been when they sculpted it? It must have been magnificent.
Super. We've got the head and the harness. It's simply the same.
Wow, it's simply the same, but really the same.
Same posture, same horse, same thing, same everything.
Everything's there. This is really great. This really is great.
The same stylistic comparison has been made between the carved faces of the Lamache site and those found on the rock walls of the Roc-aux-Sorciers at Lascaux. You take this profile from Lamache and set it on top of the profile from Roc-aux-Sorciers. There, dead right. There. You see, the profile from Lamache fits perfectly into the contours of the one from Roc-aux-Sorciers.
We can see a distinct feature appear some distance apart, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. So there's proof that these groups were in contact with each other, that there were exchanges of oral tradition, and perhaps they communicated their stories, myths, special features, and rituals. The development of the Magdalenian culture in Europe coincides with the population by Homo sapiens of the fringes of Europe and of North Africa. This is clearly one of the reasons which would lead us to expect to find in Africa, for example in Egypt, artwork which is similar or related in its themes or in the techniques used.
In February and March 2007, on the flanks of the hills of Nubian sandstone that line the banks of the Nile in the Aswan region, an international expedition made a major discovery. The team, directed by Dr. Dirk Huij from the Royal Belgian Museums of Art and History, found magnificent carvings made in the open on the rocky walls. This site, recounted in a story told by a Canadian expedition of the 1960s, had never been seriously studied. "160 carvings were revealed, with the majority being representations of animals.
What do you want?
All the carvings were listed and measured.
I need a detail of the head and the horns of the lower bovine.
This one.
Yes, that one. Just the head and the horns. Okay, got enough room?
It's all right.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, now do the same for that one.
I'm changing foot.
Just the head, huh?
Just the head, huh?
The motifs represented here offered precious information about the environment of the occupants of Kurta 15,000 years ago, and especially about the fauna. Salima Ikram of the American University of Cairo is a specialist of prehistoric representations of animals. She is identifying, with the assistant director of the mission, the animals reproduced on the rock.
So you think it's a hartebeest?
I definitely think it's a hartebeest, but look, let's see. Just in case we have any doubts, we can prove it by checking it against the hartebeest. Look at those horns here.
These horns here, yeah.
Yeah, they match up with that sort of kind of profile.
Yes, perfectly.
And then this ear is really, really striking.
I can see that, yeah. Exactly.
And then...
You see a bump?
Yeah,
here.
you've got a bump here. And what's great is over here is the tail. This tail
I can see that, yes.
Yeah, it's totally different from all your bobbed tails.
And the
but
legs
look,
also.
it just goes... And of course it fits in with what you know from the fauna of the area because they've excavated a lot of hartebeest remains.
That's correct, that's correct. Hartebeest was their main food resource.
Strange though that they haven't shown that many. They show the aurochs but not the hartebeest.
The geographical situation of Kurta hasn't really changed. The landscape is the same, and the stone carvings were made very high on the rock faces. In the Paleolithic, this was the same situation, but maybe it's significant because the emplacement of the carvings offers a panoramic view of the Nile Valley on the landscape, on the hunting ground of the Paleolithic hunters. And perhaps in that sense, we could say that the carving art of Kurta has something to do with hunting. The perspectives of this discovery at Kurta are enormous. Of course, there's art in Africa which is more ancient, but Kurta is really the first rock carving site in the open air of the Paleolithic that we have found, and that's new. It's very poorly understood that it's so similar to European Paleolithic art, practically the same thing.
It's no accident that Kurta has been called Lascaux along the Nile.
Okay, Lisa?
Okay.
So,
This is my favorite.
this is the Kurta masterpiece. It's about 4 meters long, 2 meters high. It has about 25 buffets. There's a human figure too. Quite a complex composition with lots of superimpositions.
A little reminiscent of Lascaux, you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's Lascaux-like stuff.
Amongst the majority of animal carvings made, some very stylized human silhouettes have been found.
If I had to qualify the art of Kurta, I'd say that it was a combination of naturalist art and abstract, stylized art. And that too is exactly the same thing as Magdalenian art.
Near the site, Dirk Huij and his team are also searching for tools which give excellent indications about the occupants of Kurta. Signs show us that the site was occupied over a long period, between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, because some of the carvings have been dated by Dirk Huij at the end of the Paleolithic.
Here it's just a single fish trap with one
This is the case of this fish trap used by the populations of the Nile 8,000 years ago. Who were the occupants of Kurta? A small clan that moved along the banks of the Nile? Is it possible that they had contact with migrating groups from the south of Europe? When he's not out in the field, Dirk Huij compiles all the geographical and archaeological data on the site and its surroundings. His research also involves the detailed comparison of certain motifs found at Kurta and representations found at European sites.
So here are three of the Kurta human figures, highly stylized. This is really a feminine form, reduced to a bottom, if I might say. Here, headless, armless, no feet, therefore a highly stylized figure, which compares perfectly to what we have, for example, in the Dordogne. at the late Magdalenian site of La Linde and at the late Magdalenian site of Gurnersdorf in Germany. These two Magdalenian sites are about 12,000 years old. Here's one of the wild bovine carvings of Kurta, and it's a perfect drawing, but take note of the strange way in which the rear hooves are done. And I'd go as far as to compare this to that. And that is actually the famous jumping cow of Lascaux with its hooves folded. Not in a natural way, but more or less in the same way as at Kurta. I don't think that these similarities in art can be explained by direct or indirect influence or by population migration. I think that it's a simple case of the human brain functioning in the same way everywhere, and that the people of Kurta lived in the same conditions as the Magdalenians. They had the same needs, the same occupations, the same way of life. And that produced art which is comparable to what we have in Europe. In the period when the Magdalenian developed in Europe, at Kurta in Egypt, there's rock art which can be considered to be related, but that doesn't mean that there was a cultural connection between the two.
However, traces of Magdalenian culture have been found in the north of Europe. In these flatlands, no caves or rock shelters, the hunter-gatherer groups established open-air camps. This is the case of the site of Pincefont, close to Paris, occupied 12,300 years ago.
The Magdalenians also lived on the plains of northern Europe, and the Pincefont site is a good example of seasonal occupation by Magdalenian groups. Notably, we can see the detailed spatial organization of the group in tents and habitations. We have an excellent picture of the transmission of knowledge, for example, flint knapping. On the other hand, as yet, there isn't a lot of portable art, but perhaps this was made out of material that hasn't been preserved. In any case, it's a good example of the northern extension of the Magdalenian culture.
We know at present of around 20 levels of occupation in a layer of 1 or 2 meters in depth. This superimposition of levels, separated by a few centimeters of sediment, bears witness to the repeated visits of small groups who came for a few months to a good hunting ground during the seasonal migrations of reindeer. Pincefont was only a stop along the way for these hunters as they moved about. We estimate that some groups covered up to 400 kilometers during seasonal migrations. At this time, the sea level was 100 meters lower than it is today, allowing Magdalenian groups to travel by foot to new lands. The United Kingdom, at this time attached to the European continent, was part of these new territories. Creswell Crags, a group of small caves found in a river valley some 20 miles north of Nottingham, has been known for several decades. Several Paleolithic objects have been found there, but it was only in 2003 and 2004 that the first rock carvings were discovered there by Paul Barn and an international team of archaeologists. Paul returns to the site of his discovery with Brian, the caretaker of the Creswell Caves for over 30 years.
Here we are. 2004, the light was much better outside. I was leaning on the scaffolding like this, looking up, and suddenly I saw it from the correct angle and saw that in fact it's a bird figure in bas relief and engraving. Here, the body, the neck, the beak, the eye, and it looks exactly like an ibis, something like an ibis sitting on its nest. And it's unique in Ice Age art. There are no birds on ceilings, no ibis anywhere except here. For 30 years, really, I dreamed of finding cave art in Britain. I couldn't see any reason why there should not be any, but all of the experts, all of the books said it didn't exist. And in fact, in 1989, I came to Creswell for the first time, just because it's such a famous place with very famous cave sites. I felt I really should visit the place, so I came on a tour. It was a very dull day in July. It all looked very unimpressive. I took one photograph of the valley. I walked around, I looked through the gates at the different caves. They all looked very small, very uninteresting, and I thought no more about it. But when, in 2003, we decided to start our search for Ice Age art, Creswell Crags was obviously very high on our list simply because it was such a rich collection of sites and it had produced portable art. And so it was that after a wait of 30 years, I found the art on the first morning that I looked, which was astonishing. And it's strange that you feel you've changed your country's archaeology, because every book now will have to mention that there is cave art in Britain. It was a very strange feeling. But in terms of the importance of Creswell in European terms, of course, it's hugely important. It adds a new country to the few countries that have Ice Age cave art, and it shows above all that England very much was the northwestern part of Europe. It was a part of the Magdalenian world.
According to the climatologists' estimations, the ice sheet limit at that time was only 30 kilometers north of Creswell. Paleontologists think, because of this, that the site represents the northern limit of the Magdalenian people. However far the Magdalenian culture spread, most archaeologists agree that its cradle was found in the north of Spain or southwestern France. Sculpted sites as complete and as rich as Angles are rare, and it's because of that that they attract such attention from scientists. The major goal of the archaeologists is to reconstitute this monumental sculpted frieze to show how it was originally. Geneviève Pinson and her team are listing all the crumbled blocks and recording the motifs that decorate them. But 21st century archaeology can use different recording methods. A 3D scan of the carved fragments is made. The carved rock face is swept by laser beams to record its tiniest detail. By compiling all the recordings in 3 dimensions, we can attempt to virtually assemble all the pieces. New excavation seasons are planned at the foot of the rock face to find other sculpted blocks that have been covered up by sediment over the centuries.
This figure, which is the hindquarters of a bison, probably. We don't have its head, and really we'd like to know a little more. And to know if it really is a bison, are there other figures with it? Right here we find ourselves on a part of the site which is filled in and wasn't discovered. It's certainly promising, and we'd like to find out more with new excavations.
Using radar, the ground is probed in places where some of the fallen blocks are suspected to be buried. The radar echo that comes back is very promising, as these lines show. Is the frieze of the Roc-aux-Sorciers waiting to reveal new treasures?
Before these masterpieces of Magdalenian art, with their depth, their power, we react to their aesthetic quality and even to the sensitivity of the work. But something is missing for us. And despite the improvement in our skills, our deepening knowledge, life is always missing for us. We will always be without the tradition, the true depth of the message which was associated with these works. We're in front of a sumptuous stage set, but the actors have gone.
These artworks pose us questions on the place of art in all human society. They reveal a need deeply anchored in our origins, the need to represent real or imaginary worlds.